Coming up on Primetime Politics Weekend, a command structure in chaos, a police response left floundering.
Did we err in our assessment of this? Clearly we did.
We'll update you on the inquiry looking into the invocation of the Emergencies Act and what we're learning about how Ottawa police responded. Also, a warning from the finance minister.
The world economy is slowing down, and the Canadian economy is slowing down. That is the natural, indeed, the intended consequence of the interest rate increases by the Bank of Canada.
With inflation stubbornly high and interest rates going up, Chrystia Freeland says there are tough times ahead. What does that say about her upcoming fall economic update? And take off from the Great White North.
We actually realize the space economy is expected to triple in less than 10 years. And it's going to be a future part of Canada's economic engine. And so we're just being strategic to make sure that we're positioning this niche area that Canada has to give us jobs of the future.
We'll speak with Canadian astronaut Jeremy Hansen about the new opportunities Canada's space agency is finding beyond our earthly bonds. This is Primetime Politics Weekend. Hello everyone, I'm Michael Serapio. Frustration and dysfunction, that is the picture emerging so far from the Public Order Emergency Commission, the inquiry looking into the invocation of the Emergencies Act. The first full week of testimony heard from local officials and members of the Ontario Provincial Police. And what is clear so far, infighting and distrust, even in the intelligence that existed, were hallmarks of the official response. Joining us now with her thoughts on this first full week of testimony is security analyst and associate professor of international affairs at Carleton University, Stephanie Carvin. Stephanie, nice to see you.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Listen, there's so much testimony to go over here, but I do want to begin with the matter of intelligence, because there have been, as you know, these long-standing questions about why Ottawa police were under the impression that this would be a one-weekend affair. But it turns out, in part, it's because they did not give much credence to the intelligence reports that told them otherwise. Let's take a listen to an exchange that took place on Thursday.
Now, in hindsight, what would you have done differently in this planning phase?
I suppose we would have given more credibility to the information and intelligence telling us that there was a faction that were planning on staying for a much longer period of time.
And there was also the issue, was it not, Deputy Chief, that there were some, there was a lot of people within the Ottawa Police Service who disliked the chief and were not very happy with the chief's leadership. Is that fair to say?
There was definitely some dissension, and I don't know what all the reasons for leaving were, but it was a time where I would say we were pretty divided, exhausted.
Now, as a security expert who has advised on such matters, what's your reaction to that testimony?
One of the big questions I've always had about this entire incident is why the Ottawa police did not, read the tea leaves. I mean, forget the intelligence reports. I mean, they could have just used Twitter. Many of us were online looking at the GoFundMe, which, by the time the convoy reached Ottawa had reached millions of dollars. There were clear indications that the convoy was there for the long haul. I mean, we often call it the Freedom Convoy, but some of the convoy members themselves were referring to it as Operation Bear Hug. In other words, we're going to stay there and hug the city until, the mandates are lifted and we get what we want, even though what they wanted was not exactly clear. So we learned this week that there were some pretty clear and pretty serious OPP, or Ontario Provincial Police, assessments that were basically saying this, that were increasingly highlighting the risk of violence towards the public, towards police officers, and saying, quote unquote, there was potentially a national security risk. So why this wasn't listened to either in advance or during the convoy is not entirely clear to me. And it's something that I think may not be within the precise mandate of the Public Order Emergency Commission, but is something that we should probably be looking at in terms of intelligence sharing between municipalities, the province, and the federal government.
Mm-hmm. Well, beyond the intelligence sharing, there were, as you know, other police forces who entered the picture to work with Ottawa Police, and they were initially the OPP, as you said, the provincial police, the RCMP, and the Toronto Police Services, and they, within an internal communication, criticized the Ottawa force for being, and these are their words, for being reactive with poor partner collaboration. I think the last bit people would get, but what's the danger of being reactive to a protest like we saw?
So this is just it. So they were basically assuming that this was going to be kind of like a normal average protest. I mean, Ottawa, of course, being a capital city, we're no stranger to protests. We saw multiple Black Lives Matter protests. We see protests against abortion every year. We see all different kinds of protests in the city. And usually they come, they stay for the afternoon, and they leave. And the vast majority of protests in this town are pretty peaceful. So they were kind of using linear logic here, right? Assuming that, prior examples were going to be what had happened here, without kind of looking at the difference in the nature of this particular movement and reacting to it rather than kind of going out and doing that kind of proactive assessment as to what the intentions of these convoy leaders actually was. So I think that's probably what they mean by reactive. They don't seem to have at any point gotten ahead of the curve, and clearly this was a source of frustration for other police departments.
Mm-hmm. Now, another witness who appeared before the commission was Ottawa Councillor Diane Deans, and she is the former chair of the Police Services Board in Ottawa. I want you to take a listen to what she had to say about the huge challenges the former police chief, Peter Slowly, was actually facing.
There was what I would describe as some sort of insurrection from within that was happening. And there was always some tension in the ranks with Chief Slowly right from the beginning. The honeymoon for Chief Slowly in this town was short-lived.
Now, she did walk back that word insurrection later, but it seems to point to the divisions within the ranks. How do you think that manifested itself in the kind of the response that we saw to the protest?
Well, we've been learning some pretty disturbing things, including the fact that, one, senior ranking officer was had to leave because basically it was felt that she was getting too close to the convoy movement in and of themselves. We have learned that there were Ottawa police officers that were sympathetic to the convoy, right, and may have even actually donated to it. So there's that kind of level, but it also just seems that the organization was entirely at odds with itself. And so, the prior question was about reacting. I mean, if an organization can't even get itself on board, it's no wonder they were kind of in reaction mode, that they couldn't absorb perhaps some of the information that they themselves are being given because they're too busy fighting bureaucratic battles with each other.
Mm-hmm. Now, as you know, and you alluded to it, but I do want to build on the point, because this commission is meant to determine if the Trudeau government was essentially justified in using the Emergencies Act, but it's also meant to really outline lessons learned based on what took place. So, based on what you've heard so far, what are the lessons do you think officials need to learn? What do you hope Justice Rouleau points out at the end of the day?
I keep coming back to actually October 2014 when there was the Parliament Hill shooting. And at that time, the federal government decided against having any kind of commission or inquiry as to what happened. We do know at that time, and it was, of course, a very different incident than what happened in February of this year. But we do know that there was dysfunction between the Parliamentary Protection Service, the Ottawa Police, and the RCMP, all of which had, various responsibilities that day, but didn't seem to be able to work together. And here we're seeing, again, a situation where police forces, through multiple levels of government, just simply distrusted each other, don't seem to have had a lot of respect for one another. The province just seems to have not wanted to be a part of this at all. It's like a whole separate element to this. But what we really do need is some kind of inquiry into the policing into this incident and perhaps generally in Canada. Is it still fit for purpose in the way that we organize federal policing, in the way that, we share intelligence with one another, and in particular with regards to the National Capital Region itself, is, does it make sense to have all these three levels working in the way that it is? So this is something that I don't know if the Public Order Emergencies Commission will be able to touch, because, it is limited in its scope and of course time. It has to report within 1 year. But it's something I really think that we as Canadians need to look at going forward.
Well, as you suggest, a lot of issues coming out of the protest and the response to it. So we'll be watching the commission very closely. But Stephanie, always really good to get your insight. Thank you for this. Appreciate the time.
Thank you.
That's Stephanie Carvin. Well, let's stay on the matter and bring in our weekend journalist panel. This weekend, we're joined by Susan Riley, a longtime political columnist. Alex Ballingall covers federal politics for the Toronto Star, and he's been at the commission all week, where he joins us right now. Good to see the both of you.
Hi, Michael.
See you.
Now, as I said earlier, with Stephanie, we learned so much this past week, and I do want to begin here with your thoughts on what we heard from the Ottawa Mayor, Jim Watson. He started his testimony by really describing the kind of chaos that descended on Ottawa's Centretown neighborhood. Let's all take a listen right now to Mayor Watson.
It was lawlessness. People were having parties, they were open fires, they were throwing off fireworks that were a fire hazard to heritage buildings in the downtown core. They were harassing people in restaurants, tearing off their masks. These are not sort of made up stories. These are all documented during the convoy occupation.
Susan, what stood out for you when it comes to the kind of pressure the city's mayor and other officials were feeling because of the protest?
Well, he went on to say, by the way, that he personally was a victim of a homophobic slur. And so, which was kind of news to me in the sense that I didn't realize he'd even been on the scene. But I guess he had. He was walking around amidst the chaos. The other thing that struck me was that a lot of the convoy was locally sourced. There were a lot of people from across the country who arrived in the first wave, for sure. After that, the long haulers, I guess you could say, many of them were from the rural areas around Ottawa and across the river where I live as well. So they would know Watson. He would feel a lot of pressure, both from the people within Ottawa and the people around whose travel was disrupted. Nothing about what he said surprised me, though, because he's been around for a long time. He's been in the Liberal Party, the Conservative Party. He's always been very small c conservative, I would say, and a kind of status quo kind of guy. Let's not upset the apple cart. So he wasn't a big presence while the actual occupation was going on.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Alex, as the mayor went on with his testimony, he was asked about what he could have done differently. He said that police response could have been faster. It could have been more resources had been deployed sooner, which really points to two potential failures, I think. One has to do with Ottawa Police, the other being the province of Ontario. Talk to us about those potential pitfalls.
Yeah, we've heard a lot about that over the first, 7 days of this inquiry. A lot of it has circled around, the Ottawa Police demands for more resources. We've heard from Ontario Provincial Police that, in fact, as Ottawa was trying to figure out what they needed, there was a lot of confusion, dysfunction, lack of leadership, lack of internal communication, bungled plans they thought were haphazard and potentially even dangerous for their own officers. So there's a lot of questions around sort of, descriptions of dysfunction and just a bungled police response locally. And then, the other thing with the province, that's another big sort of question mark that's been raised, I think, about, comments from the Prime Minister about Doug Ford hiding from his responsibilities, how the province at the political level didn't want to become involved in tripartite talks with the city and with the feds during the crisis. So yeah, there's definitely questions that I think the testimony so far has raised about those two issues for sure, and we'll hear more about it as we get further along in terms of former Chief Peter Slowly testifying and other officials. So it's going to be very interesting.
Yeah, because as we said, this has really just begun. This has just been the first full week of testimony. Now, I do want to pick up on your point about the Prime Minister's comments regarding the Ontario Premier, because there was this readout. It shed some light about how Justin Trudeau and the Ottawa Mayor were feeling about Doug Ford, as you said, feeling that he was hiding, and this is their quote, hiding from his responsibility. Let's take a listen to how that played out.
So what was your understanding of the political reasons of why Premier Ford, according to the Prime Minister, was hiding from his responsibility?
Well, I can't speculate on what the Prime Minister said, but I think I shared his frustration that they wouldn't participate in the tripartite. We couldn't get a clear answer as to whether they were going to support the number of officers that we needed. You know, the Premier did not come to Ottawa during the occupation. I think there was a sense by some in the community, why is the Premier not here?
Now, Susan, Doug Ford is not scheduled to appear before the Commission. But, you know, if it's the job of this body to determine why and if the Emergencies Act was triggered, should the Ontario Premier be testifying?
Yeah, it's sort of stunning. He was in Ottawa earlier this week, as you know, and he said he stood shoulder to shoulder with the Prime Minister. So clearly a different message. And he said, are you going to, testify? And he said, I wasn't asked. And I'm mystified as to why he wasn't. There are some officials from the provincial government going to be asked. That being said, excuse me, Alex would probably know better than I, but I suspect he will testify before this is over.
Alex, let's pick up on that point, because I'm wondering, do you think Doug Ford will be called before the Commission? Will his Solicitor General be called before the Commission? And if not those two, who for the Ontario government will be there?
So as of right now, I believe there's two sort of high-level bureaucrats, essentially, that are coming, that were involved in the provincial response to this. But you know, as a journalist and as somebody with just sort of a baseline interest in transparency and knowing what was happening, I would like to see the Solicitor General of Ontario come, potentially Doug Ford. There's lots of questions. You know, they were involved with certainly other demonstrations. There were demonstrations in Toronto linked with the convoy. There was the huge blockade, or the significant blockade economically and in terms of protesters at the Ambassador Bridge. Questions around how they responded to that versus how they responded to Ottawa. Our reporting this summer showed that the Ontario government actually asked the OPP, made an offer to negotiate with the protesters at the Ambassador Bridge if they stood down, which ultimately didn't happen. But there were things like that going on. Was that going on in Ottawa as well? We're not sure. If not, why? So there's a ton of questions that I think Ontario also has to answer for in this whole process.
Yeah, and I think a good background piece to that is, again, this commission is looking into the invocation of the Act, and that Act was not geographically limited. So it does apply to so many things happening across the province. You know, I do want to pick up on what you said, though, Susan, because we did hear from the Ontario Premier Doug Ford. He was at a completely different event, had nothing to do with the commission last Monday, and he was asked about the invocation of the Emergencies Act. You referenced it earlier, but I think it's worthwhile for people at home to take a listen. Here now is the Ontario Premier.
I stood shoulder to shoulder with the Prime Minister. These folks were, camping out, everything from whirlpools, disrupting downtown, disrupting the lives of the people of Ottawa. We've worked collaboratively with the Mayor and the Prime Minister.
So, Susan, I'm kind of wondering the kind of reception that comment got from federal Conservatives in Ottawa, given there is this division amongst even members of caucus as to how to react to the protest still.
Radio silence for the most part. In fact, the Conservatives haven't had a lot to say about what's been going on, really, beyond using every opportunity to blame Justin Trudeau for everything. Pierre Poilievre the other day, once again, sort of defending the people who arrived in Ottawa and claiming that, if the Prime Minister had just spoken with them, this would have been a 3-day event and life would have returned to normal. I find that conjecture highly unlikely. many of the people who came clearly wanted more than just a meeting. And, you know, I don't think many people can blame the Prime Minister for not immersing himself in that situation. It was potentially violent. Some people have said, well, there was no real violence. There were just, you know, bonfires in the street and a pig roast and a stage and a rock concert. But there were also all sorts of threats going on behind the scenes. Some of them are emerging in testimony this week. We're hearing about them, but we'd heard about them before. I think it's just very fortunate that none of those threats, you know, killing various political leaders, none of them came to pass, but that was more luck than anything.
Quickly losing time here, but I do want to play one more clip here for you, because the Ontario Premier said he stood shoulder to shoulder with the Prime Minister, as we heard. And I now want you guys to take a listen to what Jim Watson, again, the Ottawa Mayor, had to say about the invocation. Here we go.
I thought this is a very positive step to getting this situation resolved once and for all because of the provisions in the Act. So I very much supported it, and I was, as you may recall, the current chair of the Police Service Board, Eli El-Shantir, and I sent a letter to the Prime Minister thanking him for invoking the Act, because it actually acted as the catalyst for us to move forward and get that whole situation in the downtown core resolved once and for all, and give people their street and their homes back.
So here we have the three levels of government. Obviously, Justin Trudeau saying that they were justified in the invocation. We heard the Premier say he stands shoulder to shoulder with the Prime Minister. We're now hearing from the Ottawa Mayor saying that he thinks it was needed. I'm wondering if either of you think that will carry any great weight with Justice Trudeau, because, again, there's still so much testimony to hear, but three levels of government are supportive. Alex, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that there's sort of two layers to this question. There's the legal or technical aspect of whether the threshold was met to invoke the Emergencies Act, which is quite a high bar that, you know, as experts describe it to me, you know, it's kind of above my grade of understanding or whatever. But yeah, it's a high bar. So there's sort of the legal technical aspect, but then there's also the political or even maybe moral aspect to it of given the dysfunction, given the potential for violence, given the intelligence that police had, given the involvement of some extremist individuals and entities, even if the legal bar wasn't met, was this still justifiable politically and morally as a way to end this situation that was clearly out of control and out of potentially even the capacity of the local police to handle? So these are going to be all the questions moving forward. I think that we're going to have as a national community discussing this and trying to understand it for posterity.
Susan, you have less than a minute, but what do you think?
Well, I also think that there was massive public support at the time that the Emergencies Act was brought in. There was, except for the federal Conservatives and some of the Western premiers, there was pretty widespread agreement that this needed to be done. I also think that comparisons with the War Measures Act back in 1971, that Pierre Trudeau's, are facile, because this act was not targeted against any particular ethnic or minority or anything. It was an attempt just to get to restore order, and also it was cosseted by all these things. For example, there had to be an inquiry into it after, and I don't think there was ever any fear that it was going to be a permanent situation.
Well, still much to watch as in terms of the work of this commission, and the three of us have much to talk about a little later in the program. So do stay where you are. Thank you for the discussion so far. Susan Riley, Alex Ballingall, thank you for the time. We'll speak to you in a few minutes. A date for the fall economic update has yet to be announced, but ahead of that statement, we're getting a very clear picture right now from the finance minister that there will be some belt tightening in the coming months. Take a listen.
The fact is that the government simply cannot compensate every single Canadian for every single additional cost imposed by elevated global inflation. If we were to try to do that, we would be pouring fuel on the inflationary flames. We would just be making the Bank of Canada's job harder and ensuring that inflation lasted longer and that rates went up even higher.
So, some lean months ahead for both Canadians and the federal government. And to share their thoughts, we are now joined by Liberal commentator Jeff Turner, Conservative commentator Tim Powers, and NDP commentator Kim Wright. Nice to see the three of you.
Nice to see you, Michael.
So, Jeff, Mr. Turner, I'm going to begin with you here. Why is the Deputy PM making these public signals now? You know, they began this fall session talking about how they're going to be there for Canadians, introducing measures for those who are struggling. But now, these statements of recent days, and it really seems like a hard slam of the brake.
Yeah, I think we're about a month away from the fall economic update that traditionally happens in mid-November, and so it's very normal for a finance minister to begin either road testing or previewing the themes and subjects that you are likely to see in that document. And so that's what we've been seeing from the finance minister in this case, and the messages around in particular thoughts of how to support Canadians through, I think, the crisis that she just ably described in that clip you showed. This is a global crisis, in particular fueled by the war of aggression by Russia and Ukraine that is having a particular impact on food and energy prices, which are rippling all the way to a consumer's kitchen table and gas tank. And so, as she said in her clip, it is not possible for the government to make Canadians whole on that basis, and to do so would in fact fuel that inflationary fire. So they have, as you said, Michael, taken the steps of providing rent relief for low-income households where rent is a struggle. They have provided dental care for children and youth under the age of 12, and they have provided other measures that are targeted to people who will be struggling the most in that context. And that is the right thing to do, and will have a lower inflationary impact than providing, blank checks basically to all people to offset those higher costs. So I think it's a prudent approach there, and I think we're starting to see just the preview that these are really extraordinary times. These are very difficult times. We're on the precipice of perhaps an economic shock on the back end of the inflation crisis we've been going through for the last year, and nobody quite knows how that's going to go. So prudence is the name of the game, and spurring our economy in the smartest ways we have available to us is a prudent growth strategy going forward.
Tim, what's your reaction to that? Because to hear it from the Conservative leader, certainly yesterday, he was making the argument this is more than just the impacts of global pressures. This is also choices that the Liberal government has made. So what's your reaction to that?
Well, it's pre-positioning called CYA, and the government has a lot of covering to do. They want to make sure that the audience, and Jeff is right in one broad perspective, and that is, look, it's pretty normal, regardless of party, for a finance minister in the fall to set expectations, be they high or low. This government, though, has always had a bit of a challenge keeping expectations low, even in difficult times, Michael. What I found fascinating about Chrystia Freeland's comments, to your point about Pierre Poilievre, she's almost acknowledging what Poilievre has been arguing, that we can't spend the way we've been spending. Well, yes, as Jeff did, she makes the argument that, the inflationary pressures are coming from elsewhere, but there's some argumentation out there to say, well, that's not entirely the case. What's fascinating for me, though, is what's the end game here? So politicians don't precondition unless they have a sense of where they're going to go. And this used to happen a lot in the Martin days. The whole, I'm focused on this part of the body today, the whole backside is out of it, they used to say, in a much more eloquent language. And then all of a sudden, it wouldn't be quite as bad come budget time in April or May. I think the finance minister is hoping that's the case. Whether that will be the case, we shall see. But at least right now, she can say to Canadians, it's bad out there. And the last point I'd make is she, by acknowledging that they can't spend as much, may also be trying to take that weapon away from Poilievre, who has been clubbing the government with that message for the last number of months.
Kim, what's your take? Because, the comments from Ms. Freeland, they do come after the GST rebate bill gets passage in the House, after the whole Commons votes in favor of having grocery prices examined. Add to that the dental program outlined in the deal with the NDP. Is that the limit of the government concern? Does that concern you in any way, that they're not doing more?
Well, let's take a step back. And as viewers have noted, my favorite phrase around budgets and finances, show me your budget and I'll show you your values. So when we talk about what could be in the fall economic statement and in the budget in the new year, fundamentally, there are lots of things they can do. And this deal, the supply and confidence motion with the New Democrats, is actually what Jeff was alluding to, which is the GST rebate, the dental plan, and a whole host of other things that, thank goodness, the New Democrats are pushing for things that matter to Canadians. And so we'll see this coming over the next few months. What else comes forward in that deal? What I see Chrystia Freeland trying to do is, please stop asking for more things because I'm not going to spend any more money on you. I think she's frequently had her emphasis on the incorrect things. And that's, again, show me your values. Can we do things on the environment? Can we make sure that children under the age of 12 have dental care? And God knows parliamentarians can have it. Why can't children? Those are the kinds of value questions we're going to see over the coming months. And I think that this is Chrystia Freeland's pre-positioning of please don't ask me for any more things, but there are lots of things the government can and should be getting involved in. And tax cuts for CEOs is not really one of them.
Okay, so we keep talking about the fall economic statement. Let's talk about what Freeland's comments have to say about that a bit more. What are your expectations at this point then? What do you think should be in it? Jeff, I'll begin with you.
So I think what we're seeing is potentially a very small pivot by this government back into an economic message. And I think that is obviously speaking to the anxieties of people and businesses now on how the situation that's unfolding is going to play out. I think we have seen the wrong way of approaching this, most recently out of the UK, including today. I'm sure everybody's been riveted by this. The populist approach of taking maybe measures that are not well thought through, but that seem good, and right away, it doesn't matter whether it's politically popular or not. The markets spoke very clearly on that. And so, part of that restraint message is also, we've seen what happens if we are not doing things in a smart and targeted way. And in terms of the broader economic statement and in that sort of pivot to a more economic message, we're seeing a lot more discussion about how the really extraordinary times we're living in will require really extraordinary changes in the way that we trade with our partners and those who are perhaps less than partners to our values and to our objectives in the global sense of a more harmonious world and a greener and cleaner world. So I think you'll see a lot of those types of things. The other thing that, I do quite a lot of natural resources work, and it's really interesting to see how much government is really trying to understand and adjust to the new reality that the Biden administration has put down with their Inflation Reduction Act that significantly enhances subsidies and tax credits and other sort of incentives for all manner of clean investment, whether that's electric vehicles and batteries, hydrogen production, carbon sequestration, all manner of things. And every country around the world didn't see that actually being passed, and it got passed, and now Canada has to catch up to that to maintain competitiveness on those important investments.
Okay, Tim, what about you? Expectations, wants in the statement, the update?
Well, Jeff's covered a few. Let me add two, I guess, Michael. One's on healthcare, right? So if the government is making the argument that we want to care for the most vulnerable, we all know the stories across the country and live them of how bad the healthcare system is. We know the provinces have been looking for more investment over the last decade, but more particularly the last 2 years, and there's been this fight back and forth. Do the feds do anything on this now? Because with a shrinking economy, health challenges are going to increase. Second one is diving into an area Jeff mentioned. They fueled and funneled a lot of the programs that help people in COVID through an increase in natural resource revenue. That increase in natural resource revenue is not going to decline, at least in the immediate term, and particularly if you look at what happened recently in Newfoundland and Labrador, their revenues are up because of their oil royalties. So where do the oil royalties go this time, if not to emergency support programs? That, for me, will be fascinating to watch, because that does give them a bit of room to help people if they want to help people.
Yeah, a bit of room, as you say, potentially. And Kim, you heard Jeff mention what happened in the United States with the Biden administration. Those types of incentives, is that what you're looking for now in this update, this statement?
What I'm actually looking for is to really unlock the housing portfolio for affordable and attainable housing. They can do that with municipalities. They can actually empower CMHC to loosen up some of those really tight purse strings they seem to be clutching onto around affordable housing and new units for vulnerable sectors. Getting those things built and not just more press releases, that will actually start to unlock that housing supply crunch that we're seeing in every jurisdiction, large and small, across the country. I also think, and I know this is a bit pie in the sky, but I've got a platform, so I might as well throw it out here, which is, there was always that when Harper got rid of the 2% on HST, municipalities said, hey, we can actually make really good use of this for infrastructure, for housing, all sorts of things. maybe we can start to finally play around with that and actually make it be meaningful on the backs of Canadians, and not just, something that sounded really good on a press release.
Kim, thank you for that. And really, thank you to the three of you this week. That is Jeff Turner, Tim Powers, and Kim Wright.
Thank you.
Thank you.
When the Liberals campaigned in the last election, they promised to bring in so-called anti-scab legislation, essentially putting an end to the use of replacement workers during labor disputes. Now, the initiative was given new life when the NDP made anti-scab legislation a condition of their confidence deal with the government. And this week, NDP MP Alexandre Blaikie spoke as the Labour Minister announced a consultation process to get the legislation going.
I'm really proud that the NDP, we put that in the agreement that we negotiated with the Liberal government. It's a step forward for the rights of the workers. It's a good thing for the future. I think it's a good thing for the economy in general. And I'm asking everybody who is interested to participate in those really important consultations, and we will see, a bill as soon as possible.
Well, joining us now is the Labour Minister himself, Seamus O'Regan, who is also the MP for the riding of St. John's Mount Pearl. Minister, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Michael.
Now, with the announcement, you will begin this consultation process on legislation that would essentially ban replacement workers. But I'm wondering, what exactly are you hoping to learn? Because labor groups, they're very clear. They want this kind of protection, and they want it as soon as possible.
Yeah, the devil's in the details, and remember, these are tripartite negotiations, as they should be. So we're sitting down with businesses together to see, what's the best way to go about this. In my tenure now of about 1 year as Labour Minister, I have become a big fan of the negotiating table, and the more that you can keep people focused on the negotiating table, the better. I'm in no way a big fan of back-to-work legislation or other avenues that may occur, even like replacement workers. You want people's attention on the negotiating table. That's where the best deals are done. That's where the most durable deals are done. And that's, another big reason why we decided to go ahead with this. It was part of our platform in 2021, so it's not a surprise to anybody. And it is also part of our agreement after that with the NDP. This is something that we were planning on doing. People have known it would come. But I honestly see it as just kind of an evolution of workers' rights in this country that's been going on now for, over 100 years. Workers, when they come to the negotiating table, what their leverage is their work. When you involve replacement workers, you are significantly taking away from that leverage that they have at the negotiating table. Okay. So, this I think brings us back to the table and back to what I think will be a level playing field. But I always preface it, I do believe in consultations, and I don't believe in prejudicing them. So, we'll see what comes out of them.
Okay, see what comes out of them. The consultation will last until mid-December. Now, your commitment is to have legislation, introduced or passed before the end of 2023?
By the end of 2023, that's right.
So passed or introduced?
Introduced.
Introduced, yeah. Okay. Why not sooner, though? Because, as I said, labor groups, they've been pushing the government to move forward with this ever since you made the commitment in the last election, ever since you made the deal with the NDP. The push has been on to have it before 2023, not just introduced, but passed. So why not sooner?
Well, we've also got a second track of what we call maintenance of activities negotiations. There may or may not become part of that legislation. We'll see how that goes. But basically, we want to make sure that every avenue is exhausted before you get to a position where there's a work stoppage of any kind, whether it's a strike or a lockout. A lot of, just to be clear for your viewers, what we're talking about here are the things that are within our jurisdiction, my jurisdiction, which is, the private sector under federal regulation, under federal jurisdiction. And that involves a lot of transportation, a lot of telecommunications. And so, in those areas, we want to make sure, particularly where it affects supply chains like railways, airlines, supports. We want to make sure that we've exhausted absolutely every avenue that we can before we get to that position, before we get to a strike or a work stoppage of any sort. So that's what maintenance of activities comes down to. It means that, in certain circumstances, that both parties, both the employer and the employees, agree that, okay, look, while we're sitting at the negotiating table, we will make sure that these services continue for the greater good of Canadians, for the greater good of the Canadian economy. What does that look like? How can we make that faster? How can we make sure that, again, Canadians are looked after, the economy is looked after, employers and employees are looked after, while parties are sitting down at the negotiating table. So you have both of these things happening, and consultations will occur on both of these, which may or may not both factor into the legislation.
So on the one hand, protecting workers, on the other hand, making sure that the economy is not negatively impacted from taking what you're saying from you.
Absolutely.
Does that mean that you're concerned about corporate pushback here?
Well, we definitely want to hear them out. Look, I talk to employers as much as I talk to employees. I mean, maintaining that balance as a labor minister is one of the reasons why we've had such success over the course of the summer. I mean, Michael, when I came in, and very, very soon after I became labor minister, we had to deal with CP Rail, you'll recall. We had a slight work stoppage there, but we got the deal done. But after that, I mean, I was looming coming into the summer, CN, Via, Purelator, Loomis, WestJet, Bell. There were a whole host of deals, but some of them that I was, worried about in terms of supply chains and just, making sure that the economy is okay. All parties came to an agreement there. I've dealt with some amazing public servants in the portfolios I've held, but I got to tell you, the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service, these guys are unbelievable.
You mentioned the fact that this is a promise made by your party in the last election campaign. It's also a condition of your supply and confidence agreement with the NDP. Right. Would this initiative have happened without that NDP deal?
Oh yeah, it's in our platform. We were already set on doing it. Before this occurred.
Has it been given greater priority because of the deal?
No, I think it was right on course. We're exactly where we said we would be. But look, I'm very happy that it's that we have the NDP support. And look, I'm a big fan of the agreement that we have with the NDP. I work very closely with my NDP colleagues on just transition and the changes to the to our energy and the transition of energy workers. I say transition, but really what we're talking about is lowering emissions and building up renewables. And we need them to do that. We need workers to do that. So I've been working with unions, but working with my NDP colleagues on this as well. I'm happy that it's a shared priority. I'm happy to have their support. My critic for the NDP, Alexandre Boulouris, stood by my side during the press conference today in the National Press Theatre, and I was happy I'm happy for his friendship and support. He is definitely a harsh critic, but I was happy to have him with me because I know that this is something that he himself. As somebody who's been involved with the labor movement for some 20 years, this is a big day for him. I think personally, I wanted to share it with him.
Okay. Well, with that, I want to thank you for the time. Good to see you, Minister. Thank you for this.
Thank you, Michael.
NASA will attempt to launch its Artemis 1 mission in November. Now, as you may recall, previous attempts were scrubbed due to engine issues and then Hurricane Ian. But if successful, the mission will see NASA's SLS rocket and Orion spacecraft break earthly bonds and head for the moon. The mission coming nearly 50 years after the last moon landing with Apollo 17 back in 1972. Now, Canada will have a role to play in the Artemis missions, and to talk about that and other matters related to Canada's space program, we're now reaching out and joined by Canadian astronaut Colonel Jeremy Hansen. Colonel Hansen, nice to see you again. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me today.
So I want to begin with your visit to Ottawa, because you've been in the nation's capital this past week, taking part in the first annual Space Canada conference. Can you talk to us about that, the purpose of the conference, what it's essentially hoping to achieve?
Yeah, it's actually been an incredible week. I find myself finishing that off quite inspired. Just an opportunity to reunite with Canadian industry, find out what they've been up to. And as always, they never disappoint. And I'm so proud of our industry and academia too, the things that they're accomplishing, the position they're putting Canada in for the future. And the goal was just that. I saw a lot of things happen this week. Some of it was just about network and having the opportunity to get people back together. But I saw a lot of mentorship along the way, a lot of small companies, startups, for example, and they're being mentored by larger companies. They're having an opportunity to just chat, and then to discuss, for us to just share where we're at, what our goals are for a Canadian space program, and where we see ourselves in 5, 10, 20 years.
Yeah, it's interesting because here you are as a group coming together to discuss all these things. But, obviously Space Canada is a lobby group. It's trying to, tell politicians about the importance of investing in the space industry. Why should that be a priority?
Yeah, what I think the most important message is just to understand that we're not actually spending money on space. We're investing to solve problems here on the planet. And everything you see from this industry, everything we talked about is really about delivering benefits to Canadians. For example, connectivity in remote regions of Canada is a priority because we understand there's a need for every human being to be connected, to have that today, and that will enable us to do more together. And what we're already seeing it happen, but we have a Canadian company tell us that they're going to deliver high-speed, low-latency internet to every square meter of this planet. That's pretty incredible. We use RadarSat for numerous services that help us live better on this planet as Canadians. And so we're talking a lot about, what does the future of that look like? There's just so many examples. I had the opportunity to talk about health, how we see, for humans to go back to the moon and onto Mars, we need to tackle health differently. We need to evolve how we deliver healthcare. We can't take the current healthcare model and use that on the moon or Mars. It just won't work for us. And so we have this opportunity to bring the national conversation and focus it on solving remote healthcare. It's not like the Canadian Space Agency is going to solve remote healthcare. We can't. It's too complex. But we can all collaborate. We can create what we call a flexible framework to hold that contribution. And over a number of iterations, we can make a real contribution to solving healthcare on the planet and then taking that with our international partners to the moon and Mars. And these are just a few examples of what we're working on.
You mentioned international partners and the moon there. And of course, I began your introduction by talking about the Artemis missions with NASA. And this is about establishing a permanent station to orbit the moon in support of the Artemis program. How does that present an opportunity to expand the work of the Canadian Space Agency?
Yeah, so it ties into some of our priorities. I already mentioned a couple, or one of the priorities, which is health. Another one is food, growing food in remote Canada, taking that to the moon. Another one is climate. And a fourth one is robotics. And so we committed as a country to solving deep space robotics. So currently we have Canadarm2, everyone knows it's on the $5 bill. But to do space robotics around the moon is a completely different animal and requires a new solution. And this is not trivial. And Canada was asked if we would be willing to take that on. We did. And now we'll be developing Canadarm3 to enable this gateway, this space station around the moon, and also using those technologies to help us do robotics on the moon with rovers. And why? Why would we do that? Well, we actually realize the space economy is expected to triple in less than 10 years. And it's going to be a future part of Canada's economic engine. And so we're just being strategic to make sure that we're positioning this niche area that Canada has to give us jobs of the future. I was just speaking to young Canadians just before this interview, and we have to prepare that ground for them, give them some challenges for the future as well.
And when you talk about the future and the Canadian Space Agency, not only is it with NASA and the Artemis program, the CSA has also inked a memorandum of understanding with the Axiom Space Agency, which is a private company. So what type of opportunity does that present for you? You have Artemis coming up, you have Axiom coming down the pipes. Will we be seeing you in space anytime soon?
Yeah, I mean, we every astronaut we hire, we intend to fly in space. I fully expect to fly on one of the upcoming missions. So I don't know which one yet, but I'm excited for the opportunity. I count myself just a really fortunate Canadian to have the opportunity to fly in space. I'm glad you mentioned that. Axiom is it's kind of like the future coming true even faster than we imagined. When we committed to Canadarm3, I gave you the reasons why we were doing it. And we also knew that there would be this commercialization of space robotics. It was happening right before our eyes, but we didn't expect the return on that investment to come even before we got the first arm in space. it looks like we're on the cusp of selling a second arm to support this space station. And then there's other space stations endeavors that NASA is supporting, and they all need robotic arms. And so we're seeing this commercialization of space robotics happen even faster than we thought it was going to be, which is great news for Canada.
Colonel Hansen, always good to speak with you. And when you're in space, FYI, we'll be bugging you for an interview. But for now, thank you for this.
Yeah, I'll hold you to it. I look forward to that conversation.
Me too.
Have a great day.
You too. Colonel Jeremy Hansen.
Do you swear that the evidence to be given by you to this commission shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do. There was concern, absolutely, because when you saw hundreds and then it turned out to thousands of people arriving with different pickups and 18-wheelers and so on, that this was going to be bigger than any of us had imagined. The police in our city are very used to handling large protests and large visits of state leaders and so on, but nothing of this magnitude has ever been seen, quite frankly, in any city that I'm aware of in Canada in the last 25 years. The public who were living here understood fully that this was a horrific situation, and the sooner it got resolved, the better it was for everyone.
There was a certain chaos on the streets, and that feeling of chaos and rule breaking and law breaking gradually increased as things progressed.
Our city's back was against the wall. We had this outrageous behavior by people who seemed to have no respect for private property, public property, or the well-being of the citizens of Ottawa. And my job as mayor was to speak out and say, we have to end this, and the only way we're going to end it is with a significant increase and boost in the number of police officers.
You know, our police did an incredible job. They were very peaceful, they moved forward, and I am so proud to stand here and back our police right across this country and right across this province. I'll always support our police. They're professional, they're polite, and they ended up getting the job done.
Well, just some of the scenes from the public inquiry into that trucker protest turned occupation last winter. The Public Order Emergency Commission is now looking into the invocation of the Emergencies Act that brought the protest to an end. Was it in fact needed? Did the Trudeau government meet the legal threshold? And what lessons need to be learned? Well, on Monday, the Commission will begin its second full week of hearings. And to look ahead, let's bring back our weekend journalist panel. Susan Riley, a longtime political columnist. Alex Ballingall covers federal politics for the Toronto Star. Welcome back to the two of you again.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you.
So, Susan, let's begin with the look ahead here. What are you keeping an eye on as the second full week of testimony begins?
More explanation from the police, and specifically the Ottawa Police Chief, Peter Slowly, who is the former police chief, I should say, who's really at the center of has been at the center of a lot of the testimony this week. The police dysfunction, I should say, and the inability of the three police forces to get their acts together, the stunning absence of leadership, have really been very unnerving. To me, there are two things that have emerged so far. One is the police dysfunction, and the second is the lack of confident leadership at the political level. So Justin Trudeau, I guess, haunted by the memory of the War Measures Act and his father not wanting to repeat that, he really hung back. He was barely visible. Doug Ford doesn't really consider Ottawa part of Ontario, never has, so he wasn't around. And Jim Watson would make the occasional televised plea for help. But there was just no political leadership, and they left it to the police, and the police were just incapable. It was very distressing.
So looking towards that testimony in the week ahead, Alex, what about you? You're there at the commission. Anything special you'll be looking out for?
Yeah, I think definitely Peter Slowly's testimony is going to be must-watch TV and must-cover journalism, given all the questions that have been raised about what went on under his leadership. For me, also, I think that more clarity around, because when the government invoked the act, part of their justification was saying that there was potential for serious violence, and we've heard from one OPP officer, that they're sort of their chief of intelligence, that though there was potential for threats, there was never any, and there were death threats made, there were never any there was never any specific credible threat of extremist violence. And so more clarity around what police were hearing, what exactly were the risks that the federal government was talking about when they invoked the act, I think will strike at the heart of the justification and the reasons why they did it. And I would just like to know what the government exactly was referring to when they used that language in invoking the act.
Yeah, as you say.
I'd also.
Yep, go for it.
I'd
Susan.
also like to know whose side the police were on. I know this is not specifically the scope of the inquiry, but in testimony so far, it has emerged that there was at least some sympathy for the protesters among perhaps individual police officers, in some cases senior managers of the police. There were also debates and disputes about should we just go in with our truncheons and clean this up, or should we negotiate and try to talk to them and be buddies? We saw some of that in the television coverage, police sort of buddying up to the protesters. Again, I think that more than anything that Justice Rouleau decides really has undermined public confidence in the police writ large. And I don't know if that can be remedied. It certainly can't be remedied by one commission, but it's something that really is an urgent problem for the country.
Yeah, well, you certainly are getting a far more detailed picture as to what was happening behind the scenes. So as Alex said, much watched television, and of course we'll be covering it and speaking about it in the days and weeks ahead. But for now, Susan, Alex, really good to speak to the both of you. Thanks for joining us this weekend.
Thank you, Michael.
Thanks for having us.
Well, that is our program for this weekend. I'm Michael Serapio. For everyone here at CPAC, thank you for joining us. Now, as we end the program, we do want to share a special moment with you. This past week, members of Parliament paid tribute to the late and the great parliamentarian Bill Blaikie. Blaikie's career in the House spanned 4 decades, and the most poignant tribute, not surprisingly, came from his own son Daniel, who followed his father's footsteps and is today a member of Parliament himself. Daniel Blaikie's heartfelt words ends today's program. Take care, everyone.
He deeply valued tradition and family connection. Exploring and celebrating our Scottish and Irish heritage was one of the ways he connected to our family history. Growing up, Celtic music, stories, and toasts featured prominently in our family gatherings. But these things were also an important part of his public persona. The Democrats in Winnipeg have spent many evenings on a diet of Burns poetry and reflections on the state of democratic socialism in Canada in order to support NDP MPs from Elmwood-Transcona. In fact, the member for Burnaby South had the honor of being our guest speaker at just one such occasion. He and Tommy Douglas organized the first formal Burns dinners here on Parliament Hill, a tradition that was subsequently taken up by the Speaker. These dinners have served as an opportunity for politicians of all stripes to gather and relate to each other in positive ways too often drowned out by the more toxic personalities in the House of Commons. My sisters and I will be forever grateful for the many long conversations that lasted well into the wee hours of the morning, when we got to investigate the mysteries of theology, politics, and history with a master of the arts that cared for us deeply. We love you too, Dad. Earlier I mentioned his fondness for Scottish culture, so I'd like to finish this tribute with one of his favorite Scottish toasts. Here's to us, was like us, damn few, and the raw deed.